On December 25, 1991 at 7:32 p.m., the Soviet flag descended over the Kremlin and was replaced by the flag of pre-revolutionary Russia, which had white, blue, and red horizontal stripes. It was a momentous moment, but only a handful of foreigners and a grumpy Soviet veteran on Red Square witnessed it. I know this occasion because the aliens were my wife and children, who cheered when the new flag was raised in the night sky, and remembered the time. On that day 30 years ago, Mikhail Gorbachev, the last Soviet leader, gave his farewell address and then resigned, which is why I wasn't on Red Square with my family. That evening, the obituary of the Soviet state wrote in the newspaper The Times, seeing the utopian and virtuous promises that emerged from the violent turmoil of the Great October Revolution of 1917, so that the Union witnessed the last realizations of the terrible darkness with the end of December 1991, stripped of ideology, cut dismembered, broke, and hungry, but he inspires great dread even as he falls. Like many Westerners at the time, I was personally optimistic that the collapse of communism would usher in a period of steady democratization, the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama memorably proclaimed. The Russian voices I heard, however, were less optimistic. The separation from the USSR will be long and difficult, warned the state daily Izvestia. The Soviet state deprived people of freedom, but gave them something else, the pride of a superpower, a force, as Izvestia wrote, equal to nationalism, capable of uniting millions of fanatical supporters. It is doubtful that Vladimir Putin's government marked the anniversary in the week when Memorial International, Russia's most prominent human rights group, was shut down, or when the Kremlin mobilized forces on the Ukrainian border to blackmail the West into staying away from Ukraine. But these works provided a sad confirmation of what Izvestia had previously mentioned. The outgrowth of the late 1980s and 1990s was the Memorial, a largely loose organization that set out to identify and memorialize the millions of victims of Stalin's purges and labor camps. The government initially condoned it, then grudgingly tolerated it as the Kremlin became an increasingly repressive entity, and eventually Mr. Putin sent it to the dump of civic organizations that are now described as foreign agents and supporters of terror. The accusations had all the hallmarks of Soviet double rhetoric, and the commemoration was a domestic response to the terror of Soviet repression. Indeed, the closure of Memorial at a time of heightened tension over the massing of Russian forces along the Ukrainian border may not have been intentional, but it was no coincidence. Over the past 2 years, Mr. Putin has tightened his grip on power, pushing through a constitutional amendment to stay in power for life, imprisoning opposition figure Alexei Navalny, and ramping up anti-Western rhetoric. Intensely hostile Russian rhetoric coincided with the arrival of Joseph Biden to the White House, which put an end to Donald Trump's fictitious deference to Mr. Since the beginning of 2021, Vladimir Frolov, a former Russian diplomat in Washington, wrote that the Kremlin has adopted a new strategy in dealing with the West, which he ironically called the second breakthrough. In an article on the Russian-language website kolta.ru, Mr. Frolov said that the goals of the new policy were to stabilize relations with the West under conditions favorable to Russia. Ukraine's neutrality was a major goal, and to ensure that Moscow enjoyed a geopolitical position equal to that of the US and the EU. European in international affairs. Mr. Frolov claimed that behind the change was Mr. Putin's conviction that efforts to get closer to the West and accept Western values of human rights only served to undermine the Russian state. Moreover, the Kremlin believed that, in contrast to 30 years ago, the United States and its allies were now in decline and eager to rally around China, and thus were willing to pay the price of détente with Russia. Our strategy is that Russia is always right, Frolov wrote. And if that is what Mr. Putin and his cohorts really believe, they may find themselves deeply wrong. Russia today is not the Soviet Union of yesterday. Its economy is more vulnerable to Western sanctions, and the US and its allies, whatever their internal challenges, can inflict greater economic damage on the country. Russia cannot control information or exposure to the outside world in the same way that the Soviet Union did, and like much of the world, Russian citizens now get most of their information from the Internet, and travel relatively freely. Moreover, Putin's Russia lacks the ideological support that the Soviet Union offered its leaders for their monopoly on power. He is obligated to uphold democratic norms even as he continues to violate them in a charade that most Russians can see. And however many Russian citizens might share Putin's claim to a special brotherhood with Ukraine, there is no way to say how they might respond to Russia's overt military incursion into Ukraine. But the West must also realize that Russia's threats and demands are not entirely empty, and that, after ruling out a military response, it has limited leverage over Russia. However, there are ways in which the United States can defuse tensions without accepting Russia's impossible demands for a formal treaty recognizing Russia's sphere of influence over former Soviet territory. After a 50-minute phone conversation, spokesmen for both Presidents Biden and Putin said they reiterated their harsh threats. But the truth of the call, the second this month, and plans for security talks between the United States and Russia, and NATO in the coming days, are steps in the right direction, that is, channeling the crisis into diplomacy, and showing that the West is willing to take Russia's security interests seriously. Washington could also urge Ukraine to take some steps toward de-escalation. Samuel Sharap of the Rand Corporation suggested that the United States urge Ukraine to take some steps toward fulfilling its obligations under the Minsk II agreement, concluded 6 years ago. The deal called on Ukraine to delegate some powers to rebel-held areas of eastern Ukraine, effectively recognizing their special status in exchange for Russia's withdrawal from the border. Ukraine's resistance to the deal is understandable, but some moves on it may shift the current standoff toward diplomatic channels. A superpower, as Izvestia reported 3 decades ago, is usually hard to get rid of, and the West must free Mr. Putin from abusing imperial illusions. But characterizing his moves toward Ukraine as deception would be a dangerous gamble by the West, recalling the Obama administration's principle that great powers are not deceived. On December 25, 1991 at 7:32 p.m.,